Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most absolutely jaw-dropping economic miracles in human history. We're going to explore exactly how a tiny, totally resourceless patch of land transformed itself into an absolute titan of the modern world. It is an amazing story, so let's just jump right in.
$122,766. That is Singapore's modern GDP per capita. It's wild, right? It makes it one of the wealthiest nations on Earth, ranking number 2 globally and number 1 in Asia. To really put that staggering wealth into perspective, right now, today, 1 in every 6 people walking down the street in Singapore is a millionaire. Literally, 1 in 6.
But here's the crazy part. This wealth, it didn't come from oil. It didn't come from gold or, vast expanses of fertile farmland. And that brings us to the central mystery of this explainer. How exactly did a tiny island originally called Singapore, or Lion City, which was basically a swamp with zero food, absolutely zero natural resources, and no army, how did it go from total destitution to a global superpower?
To really wrap our heads around the scale of their challenge, we have to talk about the sheer geographic claustrophobia. Singapore is a city-state covering a mere 719 square kilometers. That is tiny. Think about the population density. There are over 7,000 people packed into every single square kilometer in Singapore. Contrast that with a massive country like India, which has about 430 people per square kilometer. They had absolutely no space, and let me tell you, zero room for error.
So to understand their incredible rise, we have to look at their one and only natural advantage: location. Singapore sits right on the Malacca and Sunda Straits. This is a highly lucrative, super narrow shipping route connecting the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. For centuries, this route was a giant colonial tug-of-war. The Portuguese grabbed it in 1509, then the Dutch fought them for it and took over in 1603, and finally, the British East India Company maneuvered their way in by 1819.
Now, the crucial turning point is how the British actually beat out the Dutch monopoly. The British East India Company launched this brilliant free port strategy. They basically announced, hey, doing business at the Singapore port, zero taxes, nothing, and suddenly ships from all over the globe just flooded in. To support all this traffic, massive infrastructure was built, and that sparked a huge influx of cheap labor pouring in from China, India, and neighboring Malaysia. But this booming rapid expansion, it was about to hit a devastating wall.
Yeah, this rapid population boom had a seriously dark side. The British were focused purely on making money, which meant the growing population was left with no real administration, no support network, and honestly, no hope. By 1847, the population hit 70,000. And out of those people, a staggering 15,000 workers were intentionally addicted to British-imported opium. The unmanaged port turned into this grim den of crime, extreme poverty, and severe drug dependency.
And just when things seemed like they couldn't get any bleaker, World War II arrived. In 1942, the Japanese military invaded. It took them a mere 7 days to completely defeat the British forces. What followed was a brutal occupation characterized by public mass killings, extreme torture, and forced labor. The already impoverished population was pushed to the absolute brink of starvation and despair. It was incredibly dark.
Fast forward to 1959, the British are back, but they're handing over self-governance. And this is where we meet the architect of the miracle, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. When he took office, things were a mess. 70% of the population lived in squalid slums. The country was deeply, deeply divided into ethnic enclaves, where people really only cared for their own communities. Poverty was rampant, and on top of all that, the threat of a communist takeover was looming large.
Lee Kuan Yew realized right away that without unity, any economic policy they tried was going to fail. Period. So he engineered a really radical 3-step unity blueprint. First, he created the Housing and Development Board, tearing down those slums and building subsidized apartments where he intentionally mixed different ethnicities together. Second, he built unified government schools offering top-tier, cheap education to replace all those community-segregated schools. And third, he made Malay, Chinese, Tamil, and English the official languages to force integration. It was a massive social overhaul.
But here's the thing. Forced unity just wasn't enough. Lee demanded absolute integrity. So in 1960, he passed the Draconian Prevention of Corruption Act. Anyone caught in public or private corruption faced a massive $100,000 fine and up to 7 years in jail. He even set up an independent bureau to investigate this, one that bypassed all other government departments and reported directly to him. Zero corruption was the absolute foundation for literally everything that followed.
Now, even with all these internal fixes, Singapore still had no natural resources and a tiny military.
For pure survival, Lee made a desperate gamble. On September 16, 1963, Singapore voluntarily became a state of Malaysia. To get this deal done, Singapore agreed to hand over a staggering 40% of its annual revenue to Malaysia's central government. Why? In exchange for military security and access to a broader economic market.
Well, that merger was a total disaster. Political friction and deadly race riots between the Malay and Chinese populations tore the Union apart. And then, the unthinkable happened. On August 9, 1965, the Malaysian government officially expelled Singapore. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew actually wept on national television. Singapore became the only country in the history of the modern world to have independence forced upon it entirely against its will. No one wanted this.
And if being kicked out wasn't terrifying enough, 2 years later, in 1967, the British suddenly announced they were withdrawing all their military forces from the region. Overnight, Singapore lost its remaining defense shield. Plus, thousands of locals who relied on those British bases for employment were suddenly jobless. So now, they were completely alone, defenseless, and broke.
So what do you actually do when your back is completely against the wall? You pivot, and you pivot aggressively. Lee Kuan Yew immediately helped form ASEAN to ensure peace with his neighbors. Then, he transformed the muddy, western swamp region of Jurong into a massive, state-of-the-art industrial hub. To woo foreign investors, he offered unprecedented tax holidays, literally years without paying a single dime in taxes, and implemented wildly pro-business labor laws.
And wow, did that pivot work? It worked faster than anyone could have possibly imagined. By 1970, Singapore's GDP growth skyrocketed to an unbelievable 13.94%. That was nearly tripled out of countries like India at the time. Over 250 foreign companies had set up shop, and unemployment miraculously dropped to absolute zero. Actually, they had to start importing labor just to keep up with all the factory orders.
But Lee Kuan Yew was a visionary, right? He knew that relying on cheap labor had a ceiling. So he ordered a massive strategic shift. He abandoned the old economy of labor-heavy, low-profit goods like mosquito coils and rubber and aggressively targeted high-tech, skill-intensive industries. They launched massive new tax incentives, but this time exclusively for companies manufacturing things like machinery, electronics, and pharmaceuticals.
To fuel this shiny new high-tech economy, Singapore needed capital, lots of it. At the time, the government was taking a massive 45% tax on all bank interest, which obviously kept foreign banks far, far away. In an absolute financial masterstroke, Lee Kuan Yew slashed that 45% tax rate straight down to zero. Instantly, foreign banks flooded in, transforming this former swamp into a global financial center almost overnight.
Moving into the 1980s, the focus shifted from just high-tech to high-value. The government introduced high-salary schemes to systematically reward highly skilled workers. They partnered up with foreign companies to build joint industrial training centers to rapidly upgrade their workforce's capabilities. They even poured massive government subsidies into corporate research and development and advanced automation. The ultimate goal? Maximum profit with minimal manual labor.
And the payoff of that relentless drive was just staggering. By 1983, Singapore, a country that just decades earlier was battling mass starvation and opium addiction, officially became the world's largest manufacturer and exporter of computer hard disk drives. Think about that. They had completely conquered the high-value electronic supply chain.
Now, we do have to mention that this incredible modern wealth and pristine infrastructure came with a bit of a caveat: uncompromising discipline. Singapore is famous for its strict, perfectly ordered society. To maintain this utopia, there are severe fines and sometimes even jail time for things like public smoking, littering, jaywalking, selling chewing gum, or, incredibly, even failing to flush the public toilet. The social order is ruthlessly maintained. So, this incredible journey leaves us with a really powerful question. Can this success actually be copied? You know, many nations try to replicate their tax laws or build these big business hubs, but they usually fail. Why is that? Because the true Singapore miracle wasn't just about geography or tax cuts. It was about absolute, forced unity, a ruthless zero-tolerance policy on corruption, and visionary leadership that quite literally refused to let a nation die. So what do you think? Could a blueprint like this work anywhere else today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.